Greetings, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tim Kais, and I am the host of God Save the King. And joining me today, of course, is my good friend, Michael Parker. Hello, Michael.
Hi. Hello, Tim. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, too. So this is the first official recording of the new year. So welcome, everyone. We had a repeat recording last week just because it was the new year and holidays and everybody's busy and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, this will be our first official recording of the new year. So really exciting to have Michael back on the show today. And to start with, let's go over a little business as we always do. You can listen to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. And there are a variety of ways that you can listen to both God Save the King and all the other shows on the Truth Be Told radio network. You can go to their website, which is truthbetoldnetwork.org, and click on the big listen button. You can, of course, listen on your Android app, the MyTuner app, the Wi-Fi radio app, the TuneIn radio app, and, of course, Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices. So, like I said, a little bit of business there. Lots of great ways to listen to TBTRN. So, Michael, how's your new year been so far?
It has been busy so far, and I'm hoping for a healthier, happier 2022 with less chaos and disappointments for us all.
Yeah, aren't we all? 2021 was a little on the rough side. So
yes, and knock on wood, my family has been healthy throughout this whole thing, so I'm hoping that continues.
Yeah, amen. Same here. I mean, I've been very fortunate. I've got people all around me that are sick, but fortunately, it hasn't really touched me. I've had a couple other challenging health issues personally, but at least not the C word, you know.
Have there been a lot of people ill in your workplace?
Yeah, my workplace has just been devastated by it. I mean, we went through the holiday season with, I mean, sometimes as much as 3/4 of our staff affected by COVID, and that's really tough. For those of you that don't know, I work retail music sales during the daytime. And yeah, so this was, Christmas season, retail season, that's a big deal. And to have, 50 to 75% of your staff out with COVID meant, we were working on a skeleton crew, and wow, very difficult, very, very difficult. But anyway, let's move on. Let's have some fun today.
Let's do that.
Yeah, I mean, so we have chosen a subject today that I think is going to be very exciting for a lot of people. As some of you know, Michael and I had the privilege of doing a television show together several years ago. And while we touched upon this subject, we're actually going to talk about something today that we never really got to discuss in detail, which is, what was it that the Magi saw? What's commonly referred to as the Star of Bethlehem, although Matthew chapter 2, verse 2 simply calls it his star. The Magi showed up at the court of Herod the Great and said, where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. So, Michael,
yes,
what are your thoughts on the matter?
Well, when you said we were going to touch on this subject, I remember us discussing this in preparation for the show. And you're right, I don't remember us doing too much about it on the show. But to refresh my mind, I just started going on space.com and looking up some things. And one of the things that was conspicuous to me is that in that period of time from 6 BC through like 2 BCE, there were several different conjunctions or planetary configurations that would have been conspicuous to an ancient astronomer and or astrologer. And I didn't really realize that. I mean, clearly there's the star that we're talking about, but I didn't realize that there were numerous things that would have really caught their attention.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, one thing I should say, make a kind of a disclaimer here as we start our show, is the fact that we're kind of jumping in kind of deep pretty quick. Mm-hmm. There's actually a lot of background to this that we'll just have to do on another show, and that'll be a lot of fun. We'll talk about that, about like the difference between astronomy and astrology, and right, who were the Magi and how did they approach both astronomy and astrology. I mean, there is a ton of background here that we are skipping over and just kind of diving right into the meat of this. And one of the things that we will say, however, is the fact that we are talking about a day and time when both astronomy and astrology were much more well known by the populace at large, and especially in the elite circles surrounding royalty and things like that. It was a really, really big deal. As a matter of fact, there is a scholar. I think his first name is Anthony. I forget his last name, but I think it's Anthony Aveni, Aveni, and he is an archaeoastronomy expert. And one of the things he wrote about this is he said, if you do not understand what an ancient culture thought about astronomy and astrology, you are failing to understand that culture. You cannot separate them.
Tim, we've said this before. I don't know if I've said it on the radio or not, but if you can think of a ancient culture or a primitive culture, there's no street lights, there's no television, there's no internet, there's none of these things. And at night, the big show comes on.
Exactly.
And it's out of your reach.
Mm-hmm.
And it moves around. And this would take on great importance to people. Just from a psychological standpoint, you would be in awe of this, and the smarter among the crews would begin to track those things and assign importance and or stories and or histories to them. So yes, I mean, this was a big deal to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right on the fringes already. See, it doesn't take long to get deep, right? You're right on the fringes of a critical component of understanding what it was the Magi saw. Because let's think about the shepherds for a moment, right? The shepherds are part of our story, right? And it says they were watching their flocks in the fields at night. Okay, well, that's a perfect example because, like you said, we're talking about a culture that has limited artificial light. So when the sun goes down, and yeah, they'll have a campfire and stuff like that, but yeah, they're familiar, at least vaguely familiar with the stars. Now, maybe they don't study them, but they're outside at night, and there is the night sky for them to see, as long as the weather permits, obviously. But that leads us right to this notion of the fact that, from the context of Matthew 2:2, the Magi were the only ones who saw this. No one else appeared to have noticed. Okay.
Right.
So that right there tells us something about what they saw, because what we're going to talk about here is that there are several statements out of Matthew chapter 2 that help us identify what it was the Magi saw. In other words, there's characteristics of this star, right? Like I said, Matthew chapter 2, verse 2, the Magi show up at the court of Herod the Great, and they say, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." So there was something that the Magi saw that they took note of, right? But contextually, as you continue to read, no one else apparently saw it. Herod wasn't aware, and Herod would have been, as royalty, right, in an ancient culture, he would have been aware that astronomy was a big deal. He wouldn't have been totally unaware, but apparently he either didn't have court astronomers himself, or they had missed what the Babylonian Magi did see. So very interesting to note the fact, like you said, no artificial light, but in general, the culture was much more aware of what's going on in the night sky. But somehow the Magi saw something that no one else saw.
So what you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's not that it was not visible. It's just that the Magi recognized this thing that they saw as being of significance, whereas
no one else did.
What?
No one else did.
Right.
Yeah. So let me go through the list, because here you have it. So here are the statements that we find in Matthew chapter 2 that we need to investigate to try to figure out what his star was, right? So number 1, in verse 2, we are told, "We have seen his star in the east." Okay, in the east. That tells us something, right? So that's in verse 2. Then in verse 7, we're told that Herod diligently inquired of the Magi what time the star, here we go again, appeared. So something about the star was apparently not visible and then became visible. Okay, so number one, it was in the east. Number two, it appeared. Then in verse 9, we have a repeat of in the east. And then we have two additional statements. We are told that the star went before them. And then we are also told that the star came and stood over where the young child was. So you got four statements: in the east, appeared, went before, and stood over, right? So for centuries, and I've literally got a quote here somewhere. I don't know if I can find it in my notes quickly enough to read it, but there it was John Chrysostom that I'm aware made this statement, right? And he was an early church father that, and because we can trace it all the way back to John Chrysostom, this means for centuries, this was the common thought, which he says it right in this quote. This is not the behavior of a normal star, right? So when you have an early church father saying, this is not the behavior of a normal star, what do? They start going and looking for something unique, right? Now, to contradict that and to let you know where we're headed, listening audience here, is that I believe it absolutely was a normal star. It's just that there was something very conspicuous about the movements of a normal star that is what got the Magi's attention. But let's, go back to this for a second, because this is worth talking about, right? Because if you've got an early church father laying the groundwork and saying, this is not the movements of a normal star, like I said, now they're going to go start looking for something different to explain what it was they saw. So what are these explanations? And this is where we get the traditional version of the nativity story that the Magi somehow followed, right? Because it's from that phrase, went before, right? That they somehow followed this star moving through the sky as if they used it as a directional guide.
Yes.
Right? So that's kind of where the traditional story takes us. But, other alternative explanations are, a lot of people want to say, okay, it was a comet or it was a supernova or something like that, because like a supernova would explain why it appeared. Right? That's not illogical. That's not illogical at all. Or a comet, right? Because as the orbit of a comet through the solar system would come close to the Earth, see, that would explain why it appeared all of a sudden. So those aren't illogical, but those are a couple of ideas that are still within natural laws that people have reached out to try to say, okay, this is what it was. It wasn't a normal star. It was still something celestial. It was just something highly unusual, And then you go to the other end of the spectrum, okay? If they don't think it was a normal star, and Chrysostom goes there, he tries to say that it was either an angel or that, frankly, it could have even been the Shekinah glory of God, right? And I have to say this, part of me doesn't want to say it, but I think I have to. I tripped over a Christian minister who I highly respect, very, very, very much respect. And I was actually listening to one of his lectures on an unrelated subject, right? And this is within the past maybe 90 days, listening to him a sermon on an unrelated subject, and he happened to bring up the Star of Bethlehem. And he brings it up and he says, yeah, I just don't believe it was a star at all. I believe it had to be the glory of God. And I'm like, oh, great. Here we go. Another one of these guys thinking it's the glory of God. Now, and that one, unfortunately, to me, is frankly almost kind of irresponsible, because when you claim it's something supernatural or you claim it's a miracle, right, then you don't have to explain it.
Right.
See, if it's supernatural, then there's no explanation. And then, like we said, then there are those that try to kind of have it both ways, that it was somehow a real star, right? And yet it had these bizarre characteristics of being able to move independently through the night sky, that the Magi literally used it as a visual and directional guide and followed it, quote unquote, to Bethlehem. And then finally we're often told, like, Another part of God Save the King that we've discussed at length is the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is where we get a lot of the traditional nativity story. And in the Proto-Evangelium of James, we are told that it was an exceedingly bright star and that it outshone everything. But the problem there is, as we started the show, then how come the Magi were the only one who saw it?
Right.
How does that work? How is it that no one else saw it? And Chrysostom even goes so far to say as the star was visible during the day. Yeah, and that's rough, because if it was visible during the day and it was moving through the sky, you would have had a crowd of 100,000 following it until they got to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, not just the Magi, which you and I believe was a larger entourage than
Yes.
But anyway. So anyway, but those are the kind of traditional explanations. They're kind of all over the map. It was a comet, it was a supernova, it was an angel, it was the Shekinah glory of God. It was still a real star, but it was highly unusual. It moved independently, it was extra bright, and it shone down like a spotlight on exactly where the young child was, which, see, I don't believe it was any of those things. I believe it was actually a normal star. And it was a normal star in its normal course through the night sky, not the day sky, the night sky, okay, over a period of time. And that therefore it required a trained astronomer, or more accurately, frankly, a trained astrologer to know what to look for. And I know that word's going to scare some people, but it frankly is the truth. Is a trained astronomer or a trained astrologer would be required to interpret what they saw.
So my question, Tim, is when you say it was a star,
Mm-hmm.
are you saying star in kind of a generic sense, meaning that it's not really a star, it could be a planet? Or are you saying it is actually a star?
Great question. Great question. And thank you for helping me out with that, because when you look at ancient literature, right, they did not always distinguish between a star and a planet. For one thing,
That makes sense.
they didn't necessarily know,
Right.
certainly what we know today. What they're seeing is bright lights in the sky,
Yeah.
right? And what they're seeing is that there's certain bright lights that move really slow, right?
Mhm.
That we now know and understand are the stars, right?
Mhm.
So the stars move extremely slow. We know that sign will be in that part of the sky during that month, but that next month in that same part of the sky, it's going to be that sign, right? So they move really slowly over days and weeks and months. But then you've got the planets, right? And the planets, when they are set against the backdrop of the stars, by comparison, they're the fast movers. They're cranking through the sky like you wouldn't believe. So when you look at the Greek word astron, right, which is where we get the word astronomy, right? When you look at the Greek word astron, we find it used in both secular and sacred literature to refer to a star, a planet, or even a constellation. An entire constellation is still called an astron, a star, right? And you bring up, that leads to another point that's very important, which is that there is like ancient Greek technical astronomy. Now, in ancient Greek technical astronomy, then you would start to see that distinction. But most literature is, what's the word I want to use, in layman's terms, right? So it'll clearly be astronomical in nature, but it's layman's terms, not technical jargon that only a scientist would truly understand. So it's making the same point again in a different way, which is that when we read, "For we have seen his star in the east," we have to ask ourselves, see, because that could be a comet, that could be a supernova, that could be an entire constellation, that could be a planet. So
Mhm.
great question. And for our listeners, I may slip in and out of that convention. I may call it a star, frankly, by accident, when we are talking about a planet. We are actually talking about the planet Jupiter. To kind of cut to the chase here, we're talking about the planet Jupiter. So kind of, let's, I'm going to read something. I put up a statement together here. So this is kind of a summary statement, and then we'll go through and we'll break it down, right? So the Star of Bethlehem, also known as his star, Matthew 2:2, was not a single event, but rather an unprecedented and concentrated series of events involving the planet Jupiter and the star Regulus in the constellation of Leo, beginning July 29th of 3 BC and running through October of 2 BC. Okay. And this series of events included heliacal risings, conjunctions, eclipses, occultations, and retrograde motion, all of which are very symbolically significant to a trained astrologer. Okay. So these events from late July of 3 BC all the way through to October of 2 BC, this series of signs is what the Magi saw that made them go, we have to do something, right? So they packed up and they traveled to Jerusalem because those signs told them that at the very least, a great king had been born in Judea, right? So they haul off, and I'll let you talk in a sec here. They haul off and they travel to Jerusalem where they meet with Herod. Herod tells them to go to Bethlehem. So the final thing is that when they were traveling from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, that's where we're told that the star went before them and came and stood over where the young child was, so that was like the punctuation mark that went kaboom. This is it. This was the final point. So I know you were getting ready to say something.
Well, I was going to ask you, could you enumerate for us farthest to most recent the 4 events?
Sure. So it was more than 4, right? But it was a bunch of events. I mean, it was a truckload of events, a whole bunch. But in my opinion, and it's not that the interior events are not critical, because they are, but I believe that the 2 bookends, the first event and the last event, speak the loudest. Okay, the interior events just are what push it over the top and make it just, like I said, a concentrated series of events. Okay, so that's what the interior events do, but it's the very first one and the very last one, I think, are the one that are the most provocative and help us identify what's going on here. Because take a note that the Magi said, we have seen his star in the east. Okay, now the common interpretation is that they simply meant the direction east. Okay, we have seen his star in the east. And that's not entirely incorrect, but there's more to it than that. Because in Greek, it's the Greek phrase en te Anatole. And when that phrase is used in the singular, it does mean the direction east. But when that phrase is used in the plural, it's referring to, there's not more than one direction east. Okay. So if it's used in the plural, because it's literally translated, it means in the rising, right? So I should rephrase, right? So ente Anatole means in the rising. So if you say in the rising singular, then you're implying, in the rising of the sun, the east, right? But when you're saying in its risings, plural, right? That's different. That's different. That's actually talking about a rising, right? So what they're referring to here is known as a heliacal rising of a planet in this case. You can have the heliacal rising of a star, but this is referring to the heliacal rising of a planet.
Can you explain what heliacal means?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. That's critical. So helios is the Greek word for sun, okay? So in its most basic sense, a heliacal rising is the rising of a planet in its relationship to the sun. Okay, so that's its most fundamental definition. But in layman's terms, what a heliacal rising is that it's the pre-dawn rising of a star, a planet, above the horizon for just a few minutes before the sun pops up and wipes it out. You can't see it anymore because the sun is too bright. Okay. Now, what's critical here is the fact that geophysically, what you're talking about is from the point of observation. If we're out in the early morning before dawn, and we're looking at the eastern horizon, and we're looking at the stars, it's blackout, and we're watching the stars, right? And then as we're approaching what we know is going to be sunrise, all of a sudden this really bright star pops up. Let me get on camera here. All of a sudden this bright star pops up over the horizon, right? And we see it for just a couple of minutes. Actually, because what's going to happen is that the rays of light of the sun are actually going to be there. It's just that you and I are looking at it and going, oh, look right there. The sun's starting to come up, but in the rays of the sun, look, there's that little bright star right there. And then within a couple of minutes, the sun's just too bright and you can't see it. Okay. That's the heliacal rising of a star.
Okay.
Or planet, right? And what makes this significant, I'm just going to go there. What makes this significant is this is something that the Babylonian Magi had been tracking for centuries. Okay, centuries. When we did the television show, we put up a graphic of a clay cuneiform tablet that is known as the Venus tablet of Amisaduca. Okay. Now that one it's for the planet Venus, and we're talking about Jupiter, but it's the principle is the same. That was literally a catalog of the heliacal risings of Venus from around 1500 BC. Right. So this is 1,500 years later that they have been tracking the heliacal risings of planets, right? So this is something they look for, right? And I should make this, it just occurred to me, I should definitely make this caveat right here. When you're talking about astronomy, or frankly, astrology, that is this old, there's actually a very important thing to understand. When we hear the word astrology today, we think of what is called natal astrology, Natal, which means it is going off of a birth chart. Okay. That's what 9 out of 10 people, or 99 out of 100 people, think when they hear the word astrology today. Ancient astrology wasn't primarily natal astrology at all. Ancient astrology is the technical term among astrologers, is it's called mundane astrology. And mundane astrology has to do with nations and kings and the fate of a nation, right? So that's what the ancient Babylonians were looking at. Even when they even when they start to interpret the signs are always interpreted not for themselves, it's for their state, it's for their nation. That's what's going on. Right? So this isn't natal astrology at all. This is mundane astrology, having to do with nations and states and kings and queens and stuff like that.
Okay, so perhaps I'm misunderstanding something, because I asked you about the 4, but you said there were many. So how many events are we talking about? I mean, because I found a couple that I want to bring up, but how many events are you talking about?
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, about 13 to 15. Yeah. So let's, like I said, I really want to focus on the bookends.
Okay.
Right. Because I think the bookends are what speak the loudest. And then the fact that you've got these interior, right? You've got these interior signs that they just corroborate what I'm talking about. So back to this heliacal rising, right? Because my point here is the fact that this is something the Babylonians would have been looking for. So every year they go out and they mark the heliacal rising of certain planets, right? Part of the reason is because they were super consistent, and they would use that to predict things like the flooding of the Euphrates, right? That they were able to say, okay, well, when this occurs, the Euphrates is going to flood within about 2 weeks. Okay. So that's why, sometimes that's part of the word Magi is eventually we got the word magic from the word magi. And you
Mhm.
can see this, that if you've got a group of educated men that can go outside and look at the night sky and say, yeah, the Euphrates is going to flood in a couple of weeks, and you're just the illiterate,
Yeah.
country bumpkin who doesn't know squat. Yeah, that's going to look like magic, right? So, but my point being again is they tracked these heliacal risings. It was a big deal. And then when it came to Jupiter in particular, they meticulously tracked Jupiter year round. They watched Jupiter like a hawk for its entire trip through the heavens every year. And because Jupiter engages in, and we're getting to the second bookend here, which we'll talk about in more detail in a second. But Jupiter goes into what is called retrograde motion, and so they would track retrograde motion very diligently as well, and that is a critical key to our understanding here as well. So, but my point being is that because they're watching Jupiter year round and meticulously tracking Jupiter year round, they came up with this phraseology called the stations of Jupiter. Okay. Now, I'm not an expert astronomer, not by a long shot. This is, I'm interested in the birth of Jesus Christ from every angle. That is what God Save the King is about. That's why I do in-depth research about Joseph and Mary. I do in-depth research about Herod, about Augustus, about the registration that Augustus commanded, stuff like that. But this is another component of it: is who were the Magi and what did the Magi see, right? So the retrograde motion, okay, is significant because here it is. That's the point. They would have tracked that very meticulously as well. Okay. So they tracked these stations of Jupiter. And that was my point. I'm not a professional astronomer. So I have a general understanding of the stations of Jupiter. There are other, professionals who are going to be able to tell you a lot more about the stations of Jupiter and exactly what that means. But just like we have, here we go, just like we have the Venus tablet of Amisaduca, which is a cuneiform tablet, right, from 1500 BC, that is a catalog of the heliacal risings of Venus. We have the same thing, okay, in cuneiform, clay tablets, cuneiform tablets that have been translated, and these are on display in the British Museum in London and in other museums around Europe. We have cuneiform tablets that are catalogs of the heliacal risings of Jupiter and of the retrograde motion of Jupiter, because this is what the Babylonian Magi did. This is what they did. This is what they looked for. So now if you see a bunch, right? Like upwards to a dozen to 15 signs that are a combination of heliacal risings, conjunctions, eclipses, occultations, and retrograde motion, any one of which is significant, right? Any one of which is significant. And now you see a concentrated series of events. That's why they're going, oh my God, what is going on here? This
Mhm.
is, like I keep saying, this is unprecedented. I think that's a huge key, because when we look at this heliacal rising, see, here we go, right? So you and I were talking off camera earlier that much of what I'm sharing today, I have known for 30 to 35 years. I first learned this back in the mid to late 80s, okay, that what the Magi saw was most likely, here we go, a series of events involving the planet Jupiter, the star Regulus in the constellation of Leo, right?
Mhm.
And that one of these was the heliacal rising, what would have been a heliacal rising of Jupiter, right? So now here it is 35 years later. I've been trying, Michael, for 30 years to find, see, and I don't have a lot of time or a lot of money. If I had a lot of time and a lot of money, this would have been a lot easier. I would have marched into Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles and asked to see some professional astronomer and said, okay, please help me find the information I need, right? But I've been doing this for 30 years because I've been chipping away at it a little by little based upon what resources I have. I've been asking myself, okay, when was the heliacal risings of Jupiter in the years in question, right? So if we take a broad range, if we start as early as about 10 BC, and then we go through about 1 or 2, AD as our range, and I say, okay, I want the heliacal rising of Jupiter in every year. And then I'm going to cross-reference that against all the other information that you and I have talked about at length, right? And narrow it down to which one are we talking about, okay? So I think we're talking about the heliacal rising of Jupiter in 3 BC. Because as you and I have talked about, I think Jesus was born September 11th of 3 BC.
Yes.
So if the heliacal rising of Jupiter in 3 BC is anywhere near that, that's extremely provocative, because when Herod interrogated the Magi, Herod said, here you go, right? He inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared, right? Now we learn a couple of different things from that. Number one, we learned that both Herod and the Magi connected the timing of the star with the birth of the king. Okay, not that they were necessarily exactly the same day and time, but that they were definitely connected, right?
Yes.
And we don't have time to do it today, but on a future show, we will look at, ready? Because we have it on record. We will look at the Magi's interpretation of when Alexander the Great entered Babylon. Okay, because we've got this on record. Okay. When Alexander the Great entered Babylon, the Magi recorded the stars. Okay. And so we know what they saw and how they interpreted. Okay. My point being is it didn't happen on the day, right?
Right.
Like about 30 days before Alexander entered Babylon, there was this huge sign in the sky, and they went, oh my God, what's coming? Right. And there you go. 30 days later, Alexander enters Babylon, right? So the point being is it doesn't have to be the exact day and time, right? So Herod inquired diligently of the Magi what time the star appeared. One of the things we learned from that, like I just said, repeating myself, is that both Herod and the Magi connected it to the birth of this king. Okay? Now, the second thing we learned from that verse is they said what time the star appeared. Okay, so something about the star was not visible and then became visible, right? Well, that's a heliacal rising.
Yes.
Because you can't see the star, number one, when it is physically blocked by the sun. And then number two, it's got to start in its orbit. It's got to start moving away from the sun a little bit before you get that first glimpse on that first day for just a couple of minutes. See, but see, the next day, it's going to be a little bit further away. It's going to last a couple of minutes longer. The next day, a couple of minutes longer. The next day, see, each progressive day, okay, the planet in question will be further and further away from the sun, so it will rise earlier and be visible longer, okay? But what's critical here is that, let me see if I can find it. Let me jump down to my notes here. Kaboom, kaboom, kaboom. Here it is. Okay, so in the 4th century AD, there was a Roman, ready for this? A Roman astrologer who converted to Christianity,
Yes.
who is known by the name Firmicus. Okay, so his full name would have been Julius Firmicus Maternus, right? And he wrote books on astrology, right? A Roman astrologer converted to Christianity, and he writes, if Jupiter and the sun are in conjunction and Jupiter is hidden by the sun's rays, this diminishes the fortune. Okay. Now take note what he's saying. He's talking about a heliacal rising of Jupiter. Now
Yes.
take note, he's saying that the fortune diminishes when Jupiter is hidden by the sun. Interesting. But next sentence is super revealing. But if Jupiter freed from the sun's rays and in the morning rising is together with the sun in the same sign, this indicates high honor and position. So this is what astrologers thought about the heliacal rising of Jupiter.
In Leo.
Well, in the same sign.
Okay.
Now because you're right, it's going to be in Leo, but the point being is he's pointing out the fact that you can actually have a heliacal rising where the planet is actually not in the same sign as the sun.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The following year in 2 BC, the heliacal rising of Jupiter's not in the same sign. Right? So that's part of why I believe it's 3 BC, not 2 BC that we need to be looking at, is because the heliacal rising of Jupiter in 2 BC, the sun is in Leo, but Jupiter's in Virgo. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not that that's not significant, because it is. Ironically,
Right.
It's ridiculously significant.
Yes.
But it's even more significant when Jupiter and the sun are in the same sign. Okay. So when we look at the heliacal rising of Jupiter on July 29th of 3 BC, we find Jupiter and the sun in the same sign, which is Leo. And it gets even better. They are also in conjunction with Regulus, which is the star that is quote unquote between the feet of Leo. Okay. So you've got an additional conjunction going on at the same time. And then if you look at the symbolism, because this is the key, right? The key to understanding this is the symbolism. Because number one, the sun is the son of righteousness. That's Malachi 4:2, right? Jupiter, okay, now its Babylonian name is Mul-Babar, all right, which simply means white star. But in Hebrew, the name for Jupiter is Tzedek, which means righteousness. And it is known as the king planet. Okay. So you've got the sun, righteousness. You've got Jupiter, which is also righteousness, but it's also the king planet, right? Then you've got Regulus. Now, Regulus, its Babylonian name is Lugal. And then in Hebrew, it actually has two names. Okay. In Hebrew, Regulus has the name Regel. It's where we get the word. Okay. It's where we get the word regal is actually from the Hebrew. Okay. And in Hebrew, the word regel ironically means feet. So people don't initially understand why that's significant. But when you recognize that the king rules wherever he puts his feet, okay, that's why regel became the word regal over time. And then you have verses like Isaiah 66, one that says, heaven is my throne, but the earth is my footstool. See, throne, footstool, wherever the king puts his feet is where the king reigns, right? So Regel is between the feet of Leo, right? And Leo, of course, is, each of the 12 major constellations is connected to one of the 12 tribes. And Leo is the tribe of Judah. And of course, it's just a coincidence that Judah is the royal tribe, right?
Yep.
So that was the first meaning of Regulus. The second meaning of Regulus is you can also translate it Melech, and Melech is simply the Hebrew word for king. Okay, so and Regulus has been known as the king star for millennia, right? So you've got the sun, the king planet, and the king star in the royal constellation in its heliacal rising, right? This is absolutely stunning because although geometrically it's possible, I don't believe this sign was ever observed ever before in the history of the world. It was unprecedented in the history, definitely in the history of astronomical observation.
Right.
Yeah. In the history of astronomical observation, it was an unprecedented sign. And that the Magi would have went, oh my God, right? The sun, Jupiter, Regulus, Leo, oh my word, that would have just absolutely blown them away. Now, remember what I said about how so technically the heliacal rising is the first day you can just barely see that star in the sun's, shining, and you see it for just a couple of minutes, right? But then, like I said, the star gets a little further away, a little further away, a little further away, so that each day you can see that star a little longer, a little longer, a little longer. Well, that's what we refer to as a morning star. Okay. That's technically the definition of a morning star. It's just not a star that's visible in the morning. A morning star is the days after its heliacal rising. Okay. So the days of the morning star are significant. Okay. So you had two things happen here. You had, number one, the Magi saw this unprecedented event that would have doubly reminded them, okay, now we have to continue to watch Jupiter as the morning star, because those are the most significant days of its journey through the sky, is the heliacal rising, followed by the period when it is the morning star.
Wow. Hey,
Yeah.
I want to throw something in.
Sure,
That's a lot to unpack. And when I was doing my research, I just found this interesting, and I'm just going to read it. This came from space.com, and this was an article on the subject that we're talking about. What did the Magi see? And they were pointing out some of the things that you pointed out earlier. But one of the things that really struck out to me, I'm just going to read it instead of trying to paraphrase. To the early Israelites, Leo was a constellation of great astrological significance and considered a sacred part of the sky. A very close conjunction of Venus and Jupiter would have been visible in the eastern dawn sky of the Middle East on August 12th, 3 BC.
That's one of the signs.
Yes. On February 25th, in the year 6 BC, the planets Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars formed a triangle low in the western sky. Now, that's the western sky, but anyway, that's just interesting to me. February 25th, 6 BC, 3 years. So I'm just adding to your conversation that things that were conspicuous and being taken note of were happening. This is 3 years prior.
Absolutely, yeah. That conjunction you mentioned on August 12th, because that's when, Venus was not in its heliacal rising, but Jupiter was still a morning star, right? Yeah. So that would have been well within the parameters necessary for the Magi, to still be paying attention, right? Yes. They would still been paying very, very close. They saw this unprecedented event that told them, oh my word, we got to really watch Jupiter this year. We've got to really watch Jupiter.
I've got another thing that says the Magi certainly would have especially taken note that on the evening of June 17th, Jupiter and Venus appeared even closer than they did in the dawn skies of the previous August.
Correct. Yeah, that's in 2 BC. Yeah. In June of 2 BC, I'm aware of, because that's another one of the signs. Yeah. Right. That was an extraordinary close conjunction that, here you go. To a trained observer, that would have stood out like crazy. Right. But that's one that potentially would have even stood out to an untrained observer. In other words,
because it was so bright.
Because it was so bright. That would have been an example of the shepherds could have been out at night and went, wow, look at that. Yeah. Why? What is that? That is really bright. And that's because it was Jupiter and Venus right on top of each other. So we're starting to run out of time. So let me jump forward to the other bookend and explain this, because like I said, this is a series of signs. It's a series of somewhere between about 10 and 15 signs, all of which are ultra significant. And we're skipping over 90% of them, right? I'm just letting you, what we're talking about today is the bookends. The first star, the heliacal rising of Jupiter in conjunction with Regulus in Leo, July 29th, 3 BC, an unprecedented event in the history of astronomical observation. So then they see this series of events for a little over a year. that prompts them to travel to Jerusalem. They travel to Jerusalem. They meet with Herod. Herod tells them, because they don't know exactly where this king is, right? So they go to the court of Herod. Herod tells them, go to Bethlehem, right? And then because what the Magi would have done, even while traveling, right, is they would have engaged in both their morning and their evening observation, right? They would have gone outside and done their observations like they're supposed to. So they go outside and they do their evening observation, and they see the planet Jupiter go before them and stand over where the young child was. This is a reference to Jupiter in retrograde motion, okay? Because what retrograde motion is hard to describe even with visual aids. So it's even harder to describe with just using audio. But what it is if you have the Earth's orbit, right? And we're the interior orbit, right? And then you have Jupiter, which is the exterior orbit. We are both moving the same direction, okay? But the Earth has a faster orbit than Jupiter does. So if Jupiter is initially, quote unquote, like kind of out in front of us, over time, we will catch up and pass it. And therefore, it will look like it's moving backwards.
Right.
Okay. So that's what retrograde motion is. And like I said, this is why this is so significant, right? This is why this is so significant, is we now know that the Babylonian Magi have catalogs of the stations of Jupiter, specifically describing its retrograde motion, which is why they would have noticed this. Casual observer never would have seen it, but the Magi would have walked out and went, again, they would have went, oh my God, the star we saw in its rising a year and a half ago is standing, because it would have appeared to stand over. It would have appeared to have stopped in the sky. That's the key. And that's why people for centuries said this is not a normal star, when ironically, yes, it is a normal star. Okay. And we're down to the last couple of minutes here, but it's perfect because we have the perfect punchline to wrap it up. Okay. Which is because you can go to Stellarium or Starry Night or any of the great astronomical softwares we have, and you can search for the retrograde motion of Jupiter, the stations of Jupiter in the years in question, right? And we have always postulated, I have postulated for years, that Herod died in probably right around the 1st of February of 1 BC, and that the eclipse of the moon spoken of by Josephus was on January 9th and 10th, 1 BC, and that meant that the Magi arrived at the court of Herod in December of 2 BC.
Yes.
Right? The retrograde motion of Jupiter would have caused Jupiter to stand still over Bethlehem on December 28th and 29th of 2 BC. Wow. Michael, we know what dates the Magi were in Jerusalem. The retrograde motion of Jupiter would have caused Jupiter to stand still over Bethlehem on December 28th and 29th of 2 BC. There it is, which ironically, and here's where we'll close off for today. This is why everybody thinks Jesus was born in December, is because it was the Magi. It was because the Magi showed up in December and caused such a commotion that people didn't put it together that Jesus was already 15 months old. But see, the commotion of the Magi, Herod's court, the size of the entourage, then the slaughter of the innocents. Everybody remembers December 2 BC. So then when you get 200 years later and you get the first writings about December 25th, none of them ever tell you how they arrived at December 25th. They never cite any evidence. They just assumed it had to be December. That makes complete sense. That makes complete sense. that they're basing it off of the arrival of the Magi.
Yeah, because the pomp and circumstances surrounding the entrance of the Magi and all these events, yes, that's completely logical.
Yeah, makes complete sense. So, but yeah, ladies and gentlemen, those of you listening, on Truth Be Told Radio Network, this is some pretty stunning information, and really, really exciting. I mean, we're going to wrap up here for today. Really thankful that you were with us, that you listened today. Please join us every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. So this is Tim Keyes for Michael Parker, signing off on God Save the King. Thank you for joining us. Let me hit end here. Ironically,